I'm here virtually with Mark McClellan. Mark is an incredible resource for all of us during this very difficult time. He is a physician. He is a PhD economist. He is a former FDA commissioner, former head of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and currently is the head of the Margolis Center for Policy Research. And perhaps most importantly, in terms of our ability to get access to him in this very, very difficult time, is he is a distinguished Fuqua professor. And so, Mark, we are thrilled that you can spend some time with our community in a virtual fashion.
Bill, it's good to be joining you virtually. As you know, the Margolis Center is actually physically part of Fuqua, and that close connection between the business community and business-related research and policy research is a really valuable part of our ability to contribute effectively on policy. So thanks for this opportunity to be with you.
Well, one of the bright sides of an environment where it's hard to find silver linings is that this will give you broader exposure to the Fuqua community, since you are your home as a faculty member is with Fuqua. So I'm going to jump in to a series of questions where, in my opinion, you are the world's leading expert at the intersection of government policy and business. You are, in fact, I would say in the room, if it weren't that these are all virtual conversations, you're involved in the conversations around the policy response to the COVID-19 crisis in the United States. First thing I want to ask is, hindsight makes everyone smarter, but if you went back and looked at the things that without the benefit of hindsight, you think might have had us better prepared for the current crisis, what would that be?
Well, Bill, we actually haven't had that much time to look back, given just how significant this pandemic crisis is right now. But you can always look back and see things that could have and probably should have been done better. Going back years, we've had opportunities to build up our capacity to track when an outbreak occurs, not just at a national level, but down to the local community. The data and systems are in place to do that. We've had cross-government efforts to support pandemic responses. This is by no means the first epidemic that the country's had to respond to. You know, think back to SARS when I was FDA commissioner, more recently an H1N1 outbreak in 2009 and others since then. But we don't have the ongoing surveillance capacity that we need to enable us to act very quickly. And then in retrospect, it's always easy to say we should have taken more aggressive steps to head off the spread sooner. There were certainly warning signs, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of after-action reports and analysis as to how we can prevent something like this from happening again. But we didn't, and as a result, we're catching up right now. We're looking at cases that reflect the state of steps to prevent the spread of the virus that were in place a couple of weeks ago, and that's not nearly where, at least in retrospect, we'd like to be. We aren't there yet in terms of the surge, not just the surge for potential hospital beds and ventilators that are needed, but also the surge in the rest of the response. Protective equipment for health professionals, especially who are on the front lines treating patients and helping to rule out cases of COVID-19, and supplies for diagnostic tests, the diagnostic tests themselves. And we're probably going to be behind on supply chains and catching up with this epidemic for a little while longer, despite all the intensive effort, and I mean intensive effort, that's taking place today to try to catch up and hopefully get ahead of it.
So from your point of view, I totally agree. There's little point in going back and pointing fingers and assigning blame. There is real value in figuring out the things that urgently need to happen now. So from your point of view, what are the steps that are just fundamentally important to try to get the situation under control? And so as we work our way through it, from the spectrum of what we've seen across different countries, where we've had some really bad outcomes and some better outcomes. How do we get towards the better end of the spectrum?
Well, Bill, the response to every pandemic is fundamentally similar. This is just much more serious and intensive than most. First off, for a new type of viral infection, we just don't have any immunity and we don't have any treatments available. So first steps are always the so-called non-medical or non-pharmaceutical interventions. And that is what we are all living right now. For a typical outbreak like H1N1, you might see schools closed for a period of time. You might see businesses closed and other regional steps. We've taken those steps to the ninth or 10th degree. We haven't gone as far nationally as we could. There are a number of states now that are implementing so-called shelter-in-place steps. North Carolina is not quite there yet, but getting closer. And these are about the maximum steps that you can take to prevent person-to-person spread. And that's really important during this period when we know the virus can and is being transmitted often by people who are asymptomatic. And it's really important to help us slow down the surge in the need for treatment and other aspects of response that is coming. And that's the second part, is surging. So there are a growing number of cases out there in the country and around the world. We are still very much on the steep part of the S curve of cases coming to the point where they're becoming symptomatic and needing hospital care and the like. And when everybody says it's going to get worse before it gets better, this is what they mean. You will see hospitals, especially in the most affected areas of the country, like New York, out on the West Coast, maybe New Orleans, filling up, and hopefully we'll be able to meet that surge. As I said before, we've also got real shortages of all kinds of supplies that are needed to go along with this, especially the masks and gowns and some of the reagents and pipettes and swabs that are needed to do all of the increased diagnostic testing. And right now, a lot of the focus at the federal level is on catching up in those dimensions and managing surge as best we can. And that's why the so-called non-medical intervention steps, all of this extreme physical distancing is so important right now when we don't have a whole lot of other alternatives. Then the medical side is going to increasingly kick in. We're going to get better at providing supportive care for patients who do have serious illness. I wouldn't be surprised if we do a better job of managing patients who have these serious respiratory complications. Some of it seems to be immune driven, kind of what they call cytokine storm in clinical medicine, kind of an overreaction of the body. We figured out how to treat that in other conditions, and we'll get better at this too, supporting the patients with really serious illness. We're also going to get better at some of the therapies, but that's going to take some time. The vaccine for this condition, I think, is very achievable, but not in a matter of months, probably a year and a half, even though there is an intense effort across the public and private sectors worldwide to test out a range of promising vaccine candidates. And even though all of the major pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies that are in this space are really devoting a huge amount of effort to it and preparing manufacturing capacity and all those things that you'd like to see happen. But that's still a ways down the road. Sooner will be drugs that have some antiviral effects, that they're active against this particular virus. A lot of compounds that we know have antiviral effects, and that scientific evidence from a preclinical standpoint, AI, animal studies and the like suggest will have an effect on the COVID-19 progression. There also are some very promising treatments based on immune responses. So patients who have recovered from COVID-19 have had their immune globulins used from their serum. Those have had effects in China and elsewhere, and we now have the technological capacity to do monoclonal versions of those antibodies at large scale. So companies like Regeneron are working on that now, going into clinical testing. And that's more in the matter of months and hopefully just a few months. And then, as I mentioned, some other types of therapies, ones that might mediate immune responses, things like that, also in process, literally hundreds of treatments. And then we're working on the diagnostic test side too. Right now, we've got a shortfall in the number of tests available. That's improving. That capacity is improving by the day, both because we're bringing more supplies online and because companies in the diagnostic space are developing tests that can be run on a lot more of the platforms that are out there. These include today the so-called PCR test, but FDA just approved a point of care test, one that doesn't have to be sent off to a lab for hours today, one that can be run on machines that are in hospitals, and hopefully over the coming weeks can be run on machines that are in clinics or in these special pop-up locations, drive-throughs and the like, that are good ways to test people who may have been exposed and may have COVID-19 without exposing anyone else in the healthcare system. So all of that capacity is going to ramp up as well. That's going to help us get ahead of the new cases as they happen and help us tamp down better on future outbreaks. But that's still a little ways down the road at this point. We've got some weeks ahead of us of just dealing with the current epidemic and the continuing growth in hospitalizations that's going to happen based on the cases that are already out there before we put in these intensive physical isolation steps. And we've probably got a little ways further to go in places like North Carolina that haven't gotten there yet to make sure we've got really strong physical isolation measures in place to head off future cases.
Okay, so I'm gonna that was a lot, and I'm gonna unpack some of those things that you talked about. Starting with, in our previous conversations, you've talked about this is really a supply chain crisis, and so as you think about the supplies that we need to get into the hands of the right people at the right time, do you think this is a time when the president should invoke this Emergency Powers Act, or do you think that there will be market-based solutions as companies see the need and incentive to step up and solve these challenges?
Yeah, I think it may be some of both, Bill. The president has highlighted that he does have the authority to use and has signed all the authorizations needed to activate the Defense Procurement Act. But as you said, they haven't actually come in and commanded production of a new facility to redirect dealing with the supplies needed for the response to the pandemic. Instead, they've had some quite good response, they think, from different manufacturers. So auto manufacturers converting to ventilators, alcohol manufacturers, spirits manufacturers converting to hand cleaners and the like, and a lot more expectation of supply of masks and some of the equipment for the large number of cases, like the swabs for doing diagnostic tests. I think we'll have to see. The supply is going up. The demand is also going up as we're entering this very difficult phase of this epidemic. But so far, the administration's seems to be getting, definitely is getting significant response from the business community collaboratively to redirect resources. And I know this is a high priority for business organizations, the United States Business Roundtable, Chamber of Commerce, and other industry groups have put together cross-company collaborations to help the federal government respond. Hopefully that's going to be enough and we won't have to take more drastic steps.
So you mentioned the critical role of diagnostic testing. And in fact, I think you released a paper out of the Margolis Center on the need to get there very quickly to get point of care testing, which we now apparently have approved.
Starting capacity. It's pretty limited right now. We got to wait.
Yeah. So approved, not. And so what kind of went wrong with the supply chain in order to be in a better position around the diagnostic testing, where states have announced, oh, we're not even going to test now for some people who are symptomatic, which I think what you're saying is for us to really get on top of this, we do need the diagnostic testing capacity to make progress here.
Yeah, so I'll do a little bit of the brief review after the fact look and say that in retrospect, it definitely would have been helpful for FDA to make some earlier emergency authorizations for a broader range of tests to be adopted for use in coronavirus testing, and for the federal government beyond FDA to support increased production of those tests. So we got behind by relying on tests only done by CDC and then tests only done by the CDC and state public health labs. And that was just not enough capacity. There were some issues with the test kits. Since that time, we've seen a very rapid response of tests being done in a wide range of hospital settings, so-called lab-developed tests. The major commercial labs, Quest, LabCorp, others, getting very much involved, and a lot of systems that typically have been used for other kinds of tests, either the so-called PCR tests or these other rapid tests becoming certified or becoming evaluated and pre-approved essentially by FDA for use to increase this capacity. But we still have a ways to go. By some estimates, we're over 200,000 tests that have been done in the U.S. so far. That's not nearly enough. By some estimates, we're getting up to 50, 100,000 or more test capacity per day. But we're definitely not there yet. Looking ahead, and this is some of the work that we're doing at the Margolis Center, we think there are ways to accelerate the authorization of more of these tests that are in process now, including point of care tests, including tests that people might be able to administer themselves, either with so-called self-swabbing or with using saliva sample or something like that. The FDA is taking some steps to work with the companies that are developing this capacity. I think there's probably more that needs to be done there, that we could have a kind of a national mobilization of ways of validating those tests quickly, and then some pre-commitments by both government, including the Medicare program, which is seriously affected, their beneficiaries are seriously affected by this condition, and maybe by the private sector as well, to pre-commit to buy a large supply of these tests to get more capital into the manufacturing process as well as the development process. But I think this is all going to get significantly better on the diagnostic testing side over the next few months. So again, we're not there yet, as you said, Bill. The advice is for people who are asymptomatic, even for those who are not that seriously symptomatic, to be at the back of the line behind seriously ill patients in the hospital who have a more significant risk of exposing medical personnel and others. But I think that's going to change over the next few weeks so that we can get to the point where we're doing a much better job of early detection and surveillance, and where we really can start getting a handle on how many cases are there actually in different parts of the country, and how effective have our non-medical physical isolation steps really been.
So I always knew there was a thing called strategic oil reserves. I didn't know there were strategic emergency medical reserves.
Yeah.
Has that been helpful, or has that not produce the kind of support that we need around things like swabs and so on?
It's definitely been helpful, but again, in retrospect, if you were really planning for a pandemic like this one, you would have had strategic reserves that were several orders of magnitude larger than what we've actually had on hand. So we do have additional ventilators. We did have additional masks. We're in addition converting some over from the military side and its reserves. But we're still playing catch up on supply, just given the magnitude of this outbreak and its impact.
Okay. You kind of now turning to the treatment side of things, well, treatment and prevention with a vaccine. You've already released a paper saying you think this can be done, this can be expedited. Tell us a little bit about what has to happen in order to get more viable treatments and to ultimately get to a vaccine in a very short period of time, at least on the kind of the standard scale of approvals.
Yeah, let me talk about the shorter term treatment opportunities first. That's probably not going to be vaccines, barring some kind of miracle. I think that, again, is year and a half, and for large scale availability, maybe even a bit further out there, despite some very intensive efforts going on. So in the short term, the easiest things to test and to get into clinical testing right now are antivirals or drugs that are thought to have antiviral activity that are already on the shelf, including drugs that have been approved for other uses. Those have the advantage of having a good set of safety track records available for them, and drugs that are in development but that could be accelerated. And there is a concerted effort to try to develop those treatments. It's being backed by the federal government through the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Tony Fauci's institute, as well as by the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, which is a part of HHS that maintains the stockpile, that makes other kinds of early investments in treatments and diagnostics that are needed for national protection, like a pandemic like this one. So that kind of testing is underway now. I think the questions that we should be focusing on now is whether those clinical tests are happening as quickly and effectively as they could be. This is not an easy time to do clinical trials. You don't want people who aren't that sick to be going anywhere near clinics or hospitals. So better for these kinds of prevention-oriented or early-stage treatments to be done virtually if possible. So we're seeing a big shift, just like we're doing in Duke Education and research. The same thing is happening in clinical research, a big push into what we can do more virtually. There also are challenges on the more serious side of patient treatment in getting enough patients enrolled in these studies quickly. Fortunately, we haven't had enormous outbreaks, at least not yet, in many parts of the country. So it's very important that patients who are in significant need for more aggressive or more effective therapy to get access to that and get in a study. But that's difficult if you're a hospital in New York that's kind of getting overrun right now to pull off those kinds of treatments. So what's needed is something we've done in other areas of priority clinical research, and that's kind of a platform for doing clinical trials where there's a standard approach, maybe a template that FDA works out with the industry that's developing these technologies, that has data collection methods that people can follow, that are feasible and appropriate under current circumstances, and that can be linked to a large number of clinical entities, academic centers like Duke, but also hopefully more community-based, community-facing organizations like Kaiser or Geisinger Health, ones that have a history of doing these kinds of studies more in the community. And so there's some steps that the federal government, we think, could take to accelerate this in close collaboration with the private sector. So what we want to be watching in the days ahead is just how fast are the trials that are in process for these promising treatments. How fast are they filling up? Are they hitting their benchmarks for time to completion and readout? Are there ways that that time to completion could be sped up by maybe finding ways to recruit more appropriate patients into these trials? And then alongside of this, remember that there are also patients who may not be able to get into trials. This is another reason that platform trials are good, because you can try out multiple treatments in the same study, not just each company doing its own treatment, but offering something to every seriously ill patient or every patient with COVID-19 as part of these studies. So we need to watch and see how that progresses over the coming weeks. And then for vaccine, I think it's the same kind of idea. We should be pooling evidence on what works, making sure we have the capacity to do large enough scale clinical trials. There's some phase 1 so-called trials of some vaccines underway now. Those are early safety studies to try to get the dose right and to make sure there are not any really untoward effects of these vaccines and otherwise healthy people. As soon as those studies are done, we need to have mechanisms for significant enrollment of patients in the phase 2 and larger trials to really demonstrate whether these vaccines are effective or not, and are safe enough, at least first for higher risk individuals like healthcare workers, and can be used to treat them, and then potentially a lot more people beyond that. If we do all that well, it's still going to take months because it takes some time for individuals' immunity to develop. It's going to take some time to do the studies and the readout, and we need to have the vaccine manufacturing all ready to go behind that. But I think there's a lot of attention right now on making sure we're addressing those issues globally so that we can get to a really substantial supply of vaccines as quickly as possible and have good mechanisms for making them available, not just here and not just in high-income countries, but everywhere. This is a truly global pandemic. It's not going to be under control until we treat it effectively in every single part of the planet.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm sure you've heard the saying that that we want to avoid, which is the cure is worse than the disease.
Yeah.
As I noted in your introduction, you are both a physician and an economist. And what's interesting here is as we engage in steps to flatten the curve in terms of the spread of the pandemic, it's also flattening the economy.
Yeah.
And so how do you make these judgments around the kind of the interplay between the steps that must be taken to solve the health crisis, knowing that at the same time we're creating potentially an economic crisis?
Yeah, I would add to that, Bill, it's not just an economic crisis, but in terms of cure being worse than the disease, or, as the old medical joke goes, the operation was a success, but the patient died. There are health consequences of the extreme steps that we're taking now. Not only mental health consequences for people who are in isolation, which are going to get more serious, but also for people with chronic illnesses, people with other kinds of conditions that just can't get nearly as effective treatment. That's a problem too. So I see the responses in several dimensions. First, we're doing all that we can to adjust to a more virtual economy. There's been more progress in this country on adopting telemedicine and home-based care in the last 2 weeks, and there has been in the last 10 or 20 years, which is a silver lining. We do need to move our healthcare in this direction anyway. We just it's just a very uncomfortable and hard way to do it. So hopefully we will step up to that opportunity and start delivering healthcare better and improve other aspects of our economy as well. But the sooner we can move away from these extreme isolation steps, the better from an overall economic standpoint. And I don't think that has to be a year and a half from now when we have a vaccine. Remember that the effect, there are countries around the world that have had a more modest effect of COVID-19 because they have been able to do a combination of appropriate social isolation measures, early diagnostic testing and broad availability, and then the capacity to respond really quickly when there is an identified outbreak. These are hard things to do with COVID-19 because there's a significant amount, maybe even majority of transmission via people who are not symptomatic or are not symptomatic very much. But if we do have really good broad diagnostic testing capacity, including those point of care tests that are in development now and not that far in terms of weeks to a couple of months from potentially being available, if we are able to get through this initial surge of cases and get to the point where the number of new cases and the number of new hospitalizations and deaths is going down, not up exponentially, which could happen in a matter of weeks if we're really effective at this initial physical isolation, that is going to tend to get the virus spread to die out. It's going to snuff it out. And then if we can get to the point like other countries have, where there is a stable or low number of cases and where we have confidence, increasing confidence in our capacity to respond through quick detection of any outbreaks and quick isolation of and tracing and isolation of contacts, and some effective treatments, either prophylaxis or antivirals along with it. That's a very different place to be in, again, potentially in a matter of weeks. I wish I could give you a time frame for those kinds of changes happening, which would allow the economy to get going again, hopefully sooner rather than later. I think the next couple of weeks will be really important to see, now that we have taken some very serious physical isolation steps in this country, many other countries have as well. Is that going to be enough to really slow down the growth in new cases as we get through this surge that's upon us right now? And then we'll be able to start thinking about a really effective surveillance system that we can put in place. We'll start having some treatments that will have some effect and maybe can help with prophylaxis too. And that means, in the course of weeks to a few months, maybe a very different state than what we're in today in terms of economic outlook. And I think for everybody who hates having uncertainty about what the business opportunities, the economic opportunities look like, I think we'll get a lot more clarity on this in just the next few weeks. I don't think it's going to take that long to sort it out. I would say, though, that the normal that's coming after this in a few weeks to a few months is not going to be the old normal. It's going to be kind of a new normal with hopefully a bigger emphasis on healthcare that's delivered at home and in less risky settings, settings with less risk of transmission. It's going to be some measures of social isolation, probably no handshakes for quite a while. And it's going to be people getting used to the fact that they're going to have to get tested, hopefully much more conveniently if they have symptoms, and be responsible in terms of taking steps to self-isolate and to help with containing any future outbreak. But those things are potentially manageable in a matter of weeks.
Okay. Well, that's encouraging. I'm going to ask a couple more questions that are a little bit more personal for our student community, about the economic consequences and the health consequences. So starting with the economic consequences, I mean, if we have a really hard landing with the recession, then I'm sure students are going to be worried about job opportunities and so on. So in terms of where there's going to be all kinds of investment made, do you have any suggestions for where students should be pivoting to take advantage of where there will be significant opportunities moving forward?
Well, one of those areas that I'm feeling particularly close to day in and day out right now is in healthcare, where there is a lot of investment taking place, like we were talking about before, to retool our healthcare system in a new, more virtually oriented direction. As I said, that's going to stay with us for a while, certainly for the next year. So any healthcare organization, health insurer, health system like Duke, some of the innovators that are doing digital medicine, some of the stocks that are actually up like Teladoc, there are lots of growth opportunities there. And the hope also is that by having a relatively rapid response, one that's measured in weeks for some of these extreme physical isolation steps, pulling back rather than many months, and with more certainty coming over the coming weeks, that plus all of the really strong steps that the U.S. government, other governments are taking in fiscal and monetary policy around the world will help head off a long-term downturn in the economy as well. Okay.
Now, turning to health consequences, as you know, there are positive tests in the Duke student community for COVID-19, and so this is not a theoretical exercise for the student community. So I'm just wondering, can you strike the right balance in kind of a final message to them around exercising the appropriate caution, compliance, self-monitoring, self-care, as well as don't get too freaked out, and try not to get too anxious about this. So can you kind of
Yeah.
give the
Yeah, I mean,
appropriate?
we will. It's a great topic to end on. I mean, I am confident we're going to get through all of this. It's really just a question of how long it's going to take. We are going to have a vaccine. We are going to contain this virus. It is great to be living in an age, 2020. Yes, with globalization, it is faster for these pandemics to spread. But compared to, say, the last big one we had just over a century ago, where there were over 50 million deaths and even more worldwide, we're going to have a much better response this time. And at least we're living in an era where you and I can communicate with the rest of the Duke community. I'm giving my lecture tomorrow afternoon, almost as usual. So there's no need to despair. We will get through this, and we're gonna be able to accomplish a lot even while we're living through it. And some great opportunities I've seen at Duke to help lead, including we've got students who are working on projects with companies that are engaged in some of these reforms, and just great to have the students continue to be such an integral part of life here at Duke. In terms of the things that they need to do, that students need to do now, though, just like everybody else, you have got to follow the physical isolation steps. We are only as strong in containing the spread of the epidemic, the further spread of the epidemic, as our weakest links. And right now, it's very clear that people who are asymptomatic can spread, that many young people who get the virus and who experience COVID-19 symptoms get it on the milder end of the spectrum, but you are still contagious, even before if you have very mild symptoms. So you have got to follow the recommendations from the Surgeon General and every public health authority to isolate. And hopefully this is only going to be required for a limited time period. The more that everybody participates in these non-medical steps, the faster we'll be at a stage where that next stage that I was talking about, where we'll, instead of having to manage this very big surge that could easily overwhelm the healthcare system in the next few weeks in many parts of the country, we'll be able to get to the point where the virus won't be gone, but it'll be much more manageable, with a chance to detect outbreaks very early when they're small and respond. So please pay attention to the public health messages. Please get the most you can out of the virtual opportunities that we're trying to put together, that 2020 technology makes possible in a way that was never possible before. And please keep in mind that we are going to get through this.
Mark, thank you so much for your time and wisdom. It's greatly appreciated.
Great to talk with you, Bill, and great to join the rest of the Fuqua community.